It was a self-imposed rule. Valerie Justice would not date anyone until her 15-year-old daughter, Erin, graduated high school in their Naperville, Illinois town.
Erin and I were extremely close. I had been divorced for 6 years, and she was the joy of my life. I wanted to get married again, but I wanted to concentrate on getting her through high school first. After that, I could get on with my own personal life.
But in 2003, when Erin spent her summer vacation with her father, Valerie soon felt a void in her heart.
I missed Erin tremendously, so I would visit my mother often because we lived not too far away from each other. And she was retired, and she was babysitting all the time.
And one afternoon, while visiting her mother, Valerie was happy to bump into a familiar face, 37-year-old Lawrence Lovejoy.
My mother had started babysitting for his little girl. And so many times when I would go by my mom's house, he was there. Lawrence was going through a divorce, and he was actually spending quite a bit of time there at my mom's. He was a little rough around the edges, just a t-shirt and jeans kind of person. But he was funny, and he was very charming.
Well, Lawrence was easygoing, and he was easy to talk to. He worked as a painter, and he was trying to get back on his feet.
Lawrence had been mentioned to my mother that he was looking for a place to stay. So I made the suggestion that since Erin was gone for the summer, he could share my apartment. He'd have a place to stay, I'd have some help with the rent. And I thought that would be a good arrangement.
Lawrence thought so too, and was more than happy to accept.
I would look forward to going home knowing that someone was there. He was rather entertaining, he made me laugh, and we started spending time together.
My sister Valerie was very serious, and Lawrence was the funny guy. Valerie needed that break in her seriousness by his sense of humor.
By the end of the summer, Valerie decided to break her own rule.
One of the goals that he had expressed to me was to own a home. And I've always wanted to own my own home. He wanted to really progress through life. I found myself attracted to him, and then we ended up in a relationship.
But when Erin returned home in August, she made it known she wasn't keen on having a man around the house.
It was hard for her to imagine anyone else being in the house besides her and I. She didn't want to lose her privacy. But I did not want to end the relationship.
But Valerie did want to do things right.
So at that point in my life, it was my desire to be more Christian. I did not want to continue to live with Lawrence without being married to him.
So Lawrence came up with the perfect solution.
Lawrence looked me straight in the face and told me, "I'm ready." And would I marry him? Yes. So I did say yes, that I would marry him.
After 4 months together, Valerie and Lawrence tied the knot at the local courthouse with Erin by their side.
So it was a simple ceremony. No big wedding dress, no flowers. We walked out and we were holding hands and we were on our way. The future seemed very bright.
But that brightness would soon turn to darkness as Valerie realized the choice she made would destroy everything she held dear.
He had a whole nother side to him.
She had no idea this monster was lurking in her house.
I just cried and cried. I just could not believe that he would do something so vicious.
In November of 2003, newlyweds Valerie Justice and Lawrence Lovejoy were eager to start their life together with Valerie's teenage daughter, Erin.
I was excited. I had everything that at this point that I desired. I had my daughter by my side. I was married again. And we started the process of trying to see if we could qualify for a mortgage and buy a home.
It was very important to Valerie to become a homeowner. They were on the hunt for the right house that they could all be happy in.
But the following month, Valerie came home to find Lawrence and Aaron in a screaming match.
Lawrence was so enraged, they were yelling back and forth. He was very upset that Aaron had been on the phone all afternoon, supposedly talking to boys. I didn't quite understand why he was so concerned.
There was a disconnect in their parenting styles. Lawrence felt he was going to be the one to discipline her, but Valerie didn't feel it was Lawrence's place.
I informed him that any decisions that had to do with Aaron were to be totally left up to me. He really got upset because I was basically telling him that I don't need your help. And he wasn't happy about that.
So Valerie did her best to smooth things over.
I talked to Aaron and, asked her to just wait until I'm home, before you get on the phone, and then that way there won't be any problems.
For the next few months, things seemed to be going according to plan.
There were no more big blowouts between Aaron and Lawrence. We bought a new puppy for the family, and we're making plans to purchase a townhome.
But there were a few sacrifices. Valerie took on a second job as a cashier to earn extra money for closing costs, which meant Aaron was at times a latchkey kid.
Erin would come home on her own, and I would call her and check in on her. So, we had a good system of keeping in touch with each other. Plus, Lawrence was home during the day, and then he worked the midnight shift at his company.
And Valerie couldn't help but notice that Aaron and Lawrence seemed to be fighting less often.
Aaron was in driver's ed, and so Lawrence volunteered to take her out driving. When they got home, they were both laughing, and I was relieved to see that things were getting better.
So Valerie set her sights on the closing of their new house, which was set for March 5th, 2004. But just 2 days before the closing, when Valerie made a routine call home to check on Aaron, everything changed.
Aaron answered the phone, and I said, "What are you doing?" She sounded just kind of aloof. Are you okay? Like she was preoccupied. Okay. We got off the phone, but something just didn't sit right with me.
And when Valerie received a call just a short time later from a police officer, she knew in an instant something was terribly wrong.
Lawrence had a dark side.
It was just a nightmare.
I was in complete shock. What he did was just devastating.
On March 3rd, 2004, Valerie Justice felt a knot in her stomach after receiving a call from the local police.
The police officer said that they had my daughter. There was a problem. He said that I needed to come to this address he gave me. That's all he would tell me. I hung up the phone with him. I was scared. Now I'm like, what the heck's going on?
Valerie was in a panic as she immediately raced to the address.
I just had no idea what could possibly be the problem. When I arrived, the police officer immediately took me up to an apartment. It was a friend of Aaron's who she went to school with.
Officers led Valerie into the living room, where she found Aaron sitting on the couch, visibly shaken.
That's when the police officer told me, according to Aaron, that Lawrence had sexually assaulted her. So I said, "What do you mean?" Aaron said she had come home from track practice. And Lawrence offered to give her a massage. She told him to stop, and he just kept going. I was shocked. After all, he had a daughter of his own. And it really upset me. I was like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I'm listening to what she is saying, and I'm trying to absorb it all. I didn't want to believe that this was really happening. But I made it very clear to Erin that I was going to support her no matter what.
At the hospital, Valerie stood by Erin's side as a doctor administered a rape kit.
The doctor told me that there were no physical signs of penetration. That put a shadow of a doubt in my mind. I was struggling with the whole thing. I questioned her, and I said, if this for some reason was because you're having a problem with him, I said, tell me now, because this is pretty serious. But she assured me that she was telling the absolute truth.
At first, I just didn't believe it. I was like, no, that just can't be. He's just not like that.
Meanwhile, at the police station, Lawrence told investigators something else entirely.
Lawrence indicated that Erin was just upset at him because he had questioned her cell phone usage. And because he was questioning her, she made the entire story up.
Without a confession, police didn't have enough to hold him.
There was saliva found on her cheek and on her breast. And it was the decision of the DuPage County State's Attorney's Office not to file charges until the DNA results came back from the crime lab. So Lawrence was not arrested that evening.
In the meantime, Valerie had saved enough money to close on the townhouse herself and settled on a new living arrangement, which didn't include Lawrence.
I got everything moved, and I didn't really know where he was staying. And I told Lawrence I did not want him around my daughter until we had gotten the DNA results. If the DNA results came back positive, my plan was to divorce Lawrence immediately.
But just a few weeks later, Valerie found herself in a bind and was compelled to ask Lawrence for a favor.
The puppy had gotten sick and needed to have a follow-up appointment with the vet. I asked Lawrence, and he made the appointment, and he was going to take her to the vet.
There was no chance Erin would run into Lawrence at the house, since she was going to spend the week with her father. But at the last minute, Erin's father canceled.
He was supposed to pick her up in the morning, but he had called to say that he was not going to be able to do that. So I called Lawrence, and I told him that he would need to move the puppy's appointment. And then he said to me, okay, I will call the vet and do that right now. So I was relieved.
Within the hour, Valerie decided to check in on her daughter and make sure she was waking up.
When I called, I didn't get any answer. And I'm wondering, why isn't she answering? I started to get a little anxious. I finally went to my boss and I said, I just need to go home and check and see what's going on. I was thinking, maybe she just overslept, maybe she was in the shower. But, I had no idea. I had no idea.
And when Valerie arrived home, nothing could have prepared her for the horror she would find.
It was the most heinous attack that I have ever seen.
It was unimaginable what he did.
There was blood everywhere. My whole world just ended.
On the morning of March 27, 2004, Valerie Justice prayed that her daughter Erin was okay as she arrived home.
I started to call her name and was not getting any response. Immediately, I knew something was wrong. I got into the hallway, and I could tell there was something on the walls. I ran into her bedroom, and she's not in her bed. Across the hall was her bathroom. I pushed the bathroom door open. I saw Erin in the bathtub. There was blood all over the floor. I knew when I saw her that it was too late. I felt like I was suspended in space. It just felt like I was just spinning.
Stunned with horror, Valerie ran to the hall and called 911.
Now all I can remember is the dispatcher telling me that I have to stop screaming and that they were sending somebody over. I just sat down on the stairs. I couldn't move.
Police arrived within minutes and found that whoever had murdered Erin resorted to a disturbing level of violence.
Erin was stabbed, she was bludgeoned, and then she was drowned. Erin had lethal doses of cold medication in her system. I believe she was forced to take it. There was a rather deep knife wound to her neck. Whoever did this had a lot of hatred in them. It was the most brutal, vicious, heinous attack that I have ever seen.
And Lawrence Lovejoy quickly rose to the top of the list as a person of interest.
The next day, we began interviewing Lawrence Lovejoy. From 7 until 12:30, he could not account for what he did and where he was at. But we didn't have enough evidence to keep him, so we had to let him go.
As investigators continued to gather evidence, Valerie tried to come to grips with what had happened.
It was so hard to fathom that someone could be that evil and do that to a helpless child. I knew in my gut that Lawrence was responsible for my daughter's death.
So I went to Copley Hospital. When I got there, all the kids was there. And I realized that it was real.
3 months later, the DNA found on Erin during the alleged rape came back as a positive match to Lawrence Lovejoy. And when police identified Lawrence's footprint at the crime scene, there was no denying that he was Erin's killer.
I believe Lawrence Lovejoy went over there to try to talk her out of filing charges against him for a sexual assault because he thought the results would come back with his DNA. And Erin was not giving that to him. He killed her in such a brutal way, I think he just snapped.
On August 20th, 2004, Lawrence Lovejoy was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Erin Justice. 1 month later, he was indicted on charges of sexual assault and sexual abuse.
I was absolutely sick to my stomach. I felt responsible. It was me who allowed this monster into our lives. It hits me like a brick.
Valerie now realized that Lawrence must have become obsessed with Erin.
His rage about Erin being on the phone was out of place. He had some jealous rage against Erin talking to boys. I think the reason why Lawrence offered to take Erin driving that day was to gain her confidence. Maybe she would feel close to him. He didn't know my Erin.
In 2007, Lawrence Lovejoy went to trial and was found guilty of first-degree murder. In light of his conviction, the sexual assault and abuse charges were dropped. But because of a technicality with a blood test, the conviction was overturned 2 years later.
That was discouraging, but we knew we had to go to trial on this again. It was going to be another guilty.
Finally, in 2011, Lawrence Lovejoy was once again convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.
It was rather bittersweet when Lawrence was convicted and didn't bring my daughter back. But I was glad that he couldn't be free to harm anyone else.
Today, Valerie is still haunted by Erin's death and wonders if she could have done more to protect her.
I never saw any sign that I needed to fear for my daughter's life. There just were no signs that he would have been capable of such horrible actions.
It was really tough. It hurts every day. But it's through faith and conviction that we all carry on.
I know that in this world no one's perfect, but Aaron was perfect for me. We were a perfect fit. I look forward to seeing my precious daughter again.
Living near a place called Holiday, Florida might seem like fun, but for Crystal Kunkel, life was far from a tropical vacation. In the spring of 2002, after ending a 3-year relationship with the father of her newborn, the 22-year-old found herself transforming from a carefree young woman into a caregiver.
It had been 4 months since the last relationship. I was a single mother working really long hours at a window treatment company. I had a 6-month-old son, and between working and taking care of my son, it felt like I was going to have to juggle work and motherhood alone forever.
Romance seemed like a thing of the past until one day that March when Crystal saw a glimmer of hope.
My dad and I worked together, and I saw him and this guy, and I noticed that he was attractive, good-looking.
This is my daughter, Crystal. Oh, I don't think we've met before.
As Crystal's father introduced her to Tommy Garcia, one of her co-workers, she could tell right away that the 28-year-old was different.
The first thing I noticed was he was outgoing and nice.
It's great meeting you.
And her instinct was confirmed over the next several weeks.
Tommy treated me really nice and sweet, and he would chat in his spare time at work. It seemed like he really liked me. I decided to show Tommy a picture of my son.
Oh my gosh, he has your eyes. Beautiful.
Tommy told me that he also had a young son. He was trying to get full custody of him. It gave Tommy and I a connection and made me feel like he was a really good family guy.
A few weeks later, Crystal and Tommy were eager to take their idle office chit-chat off the clock.
We would spend time with my son and with his son. I was having a lot of fun, and we were really falling in love.
Over the next 4 months, the two became inseparable and decided to take the next step.
I love being here with you. What if I moved in here with you?
Of course. It was great to have someone you could finally connect with and help raise my son. Tommy was like a single mother's dream come true.
So when Tommy took Crystal out for a romantic dinner on March 29, 2003, and popped the question,
Crystal, will you be my lawfully wedded wife?
Yeah.
she didn't have to think twice.
Tommy seemed to be nice and genuine. And he treated my grandson wonderfully. And I was very happy for both of them.
Although the lovebirds initially planned their nuptials for the following year, another joyous event soon eclipsed those plans.
About 6 months later, we found out we would be having a baby. So we decided to postpone the wedding.
In February of 2004, Crystal gave birth to another bouncing baby boy, while Tommy gained custody of his 6-year-old son and adopted Crystal's first child. And 1 year later, the two were united as one in a magical wedding ceremony.
I had the perfect dress, perfect cake, everything was perfect.
It was a very good wedding, very nice, perfect start to a family.
We were both really happy. But having all these kids, we needed a little bit more money, so I decided that I would work at a local pharmacy. And Tommy took a job at a landscaping company.
For the next 6 years, the Garcias lived busy lives with a full house. But in October 2011, Crystal started to notice a slight shift in Tommy's typically predictable behavior.
We started to have some weird problems with the car. He called me about an hour after work one day saying that he was going to get the tire fixed. And he said he would be home in about another half an hour.
And when Tommy came home late again the following week, Citing more tire trouble, Crystal was puzzled.
He said, well, they must have never fixed it right the first time. I didn't have really any reason to doubt him, but I thought it was really weird.
Then, a few weeks later, things took an even stranger turn.
We were getting ready to head out for the day, and my son asked me for a toy out of the car. So I went to the car. I was looking for my son's toy. I saw this gun laying underneath the seat.
What are you doing?
In November 2011, after finding a gun in her husband Tommy's car, Crystal Garcia was starting to worry something was afoot.
What are you doing?
What is this?
It's nothing, all right? It's a pellet gun. It shoots air.
Tommy immediately got mad that I found it. And I said, what are you getting so mad about? Then he justified it, saying he played with it at work. I guess they would do different guy things during lunch. And I thought, they're all guys that work together. Maybe they do play with pellet guns, I don't know.
Why is it underneath the seat with all the toys? What if one of the kids had found it?
Look, it's nothing, all right? Just relax. I got it.
I thought it was kind of weird and suspicious that he was so mad about the situation.
Then, a few weeks later, as the couple attended a family event, Crystal noticed something creepy.
Tommy was talking to two young teenage girls, telling them that they were smart and beautiful.
You're going out really nicely.
Seemed really inappropriate, and the girls felt a little uncomfortable by the advance he had made.
It turned the picnic into an awkward situation. I just found it very off base and unacceptable.
I felt embarrassed, so I confronted Tommy. He said that they'd taken it all wrong. That wasn't what he meant by it. He just justified it again, that everything was fine.
And on the night of February 15th, 2012, her husband's strange behavior reached its peak.
Tommy would play basketball with his friends, and he would usually come home around 10 o'clock at night, and it was getting to be 11:30 at night, and I started to get worried. And I was mad because he was out so late and he hadn't called.
Finally, Tommy walked in the door.
It's about time.
He was hyper, he was talking really fast. He was really excited. So I said, what are you doing coming home so late? He didn't think it was a big deal that he didn't call or anything. He said, I had to get the tire filled up with air. I was angry that it was another tire story. Just didn't really seem like it could be true.
Air in the tire.
Yeah, in the gas station. I found this phone.
Then he told me that he also found this phone by the air pumps. He said it's a brand new phone. He said he checked in the gas station and they didn't know who it belonged to.
Nobody claimed it, so I figured one of our kids could use it.
Then he told me that he wanted to give our son the cell phone. I asked to look at the phone, but he wouldn't let me see it. He said that there was no information on it. It had been wiped clean. I thought it was kind of weird that there was this new phone that all the information had been erased from. I didn't really think it made sense.
Crystal told me Tommy was acting a little odd, and I told her just to keep her eyes open and make sure he's not just telling stories.
I found Tommy's behavior really confusing, and I didn't really know what to do to get to the bottom of it.
But Crystal wouldn't have to wait long.
The next night I was at work and I got a phone call.
Hello?
It was Tommy. He said that I needed to come home.
I need you to come home right away.
What's going on?
Miss Garcia?
Police officer got on the phone. I thought, oh my God.
In February 2012, after getting a call from her husband Tommy, Crystal Garcia was completely caught off guard when a police officer got on the line and said Tommy was being arrested.
The police officer said, "You're gonna need to come home and watch the kids."
And then the police officer told her why.
What? I was completely shocked, and I thought that there was some kind of mistake. I couldn't believe my husband could do that.
I'm on my way.
Her mind reeling, Crystal raced home.
I pulled onto our street. There was cop cars everywhere. My car was being seized. It was like something out of a movie. I was completely shocked, completely devastated that everything seemed to be falling apart right in front of me. The kids were in the window. Seeing the kids, the lights flashing, it was all like a nightmare. And my sons were looking at their father in handcuffs in front of the house. I felt that they shouldn't have to see something like that. They're probably scared.
Ms. Garcia, can't talk to him right now. We're going to process them.
The cops didn't let me say anything. They didn't let him talk. They just told him, "Kiss me goodbye."
The next morning, when Tommy called from jail, he assured his wife that it was all a huge misunderstanding.
He told me that he did know the woman, and he said, "It's not what you think. I gave a girl a ride home once, and she'd made an advance, and he'd turned her down, and she was upset and accusing him of rape." I thought that was a little weird. But I felt like there was really no reason for me not to trust him. I just hoped that it was true what he was saying.
But when a detective showed up the next day, her faith in Tommy's story really began to wane.
He said, this girl who had been raped lost something, and we've been looking for it, and we can't seem to find it anywhere.
You haven't found your cell phone.
And I said, "Oh my God."
Crystal's heart sank as she remembered Tommy giving their son a cell phone he said he found. And then the detective dropped a bombshell.
3 additional rape charges have been placed against Tommy.
Altogether, there's 4 rape charges and 2 kidnapping charges.
The detective explained that after Tommy's arrest, they discovered evidence that could tie him to 3 other rapes.
It felt like the whole world was crashing down. I was completely devastated. I couldn't believe that this could happen.
Crystal tried to stand on her own and try to muscle through it. She wanted to believe her husband was innocent. She wanted to believe that in the worst way.
I wanted to see what was really going on. So I got the police records at the county building, and I read the whole report.
Crystal was completely blindsided as she read that Tommy had admitted to being with all the victims. Devastated, she immediately confronted her husband at jail the next day.
Stop.
I said, "I just looked at the police report, and it says you admitted to the police that you were with all of these women."
You read her report.
I said, "You told me that everybody was lying, the cops were lying, and this girl was lying." I said, "At what point are you lying?"
God, tell me the truth.
It was really the first moment where I knew he was lying.
Believe me.
I was really mad that not only that he'd done it, that he led me on to believe that he didn't do it. It was just coming to me all at once. I couldn't believe that he could do this to me, to the kids, to everybody. So I decided I was filing for a divorce. I felt like this is it. I'm done.
And as prosecutors prepared for Tommy's trial, Crystal would finally learn the whole truth. And it was more horrendous than she could have possibly imagined.
It was unbelievable.
This was just the tip of the iceberg.
It was just unreal to believe. I felt like I was with somebody I never knew.
In July of 2013, Crystal Garcia was still in shock when her husband Tommy went to trial for sexual battery and kidnapping and had been charged with 3 other possible rapes.
I had cried pretty much every day, like I couldn't believe that this had happened to me and happened to the kids.
In court, the horrible details of the crime finally came to light.
The night he came home from basketball with the cell phone, Tommy had been driving down the road and he saw a woman.
Tommy drove by this woman and asked her if she wanted a ride.
I said no.
He came back a second time. And she said no again.
I said get in the car!
They drove up to the wooden area. He forced her out of the car and performed several sexual acts.
Then he took her phone so she wasn't able to call for help. And as she was driving away,
she was able to follow his taillights out of the area. She was able to flag down a motorist and call the police. She was able to give a description of the car and actually a description of the perpetrator. Police used that information to put together a DMV photo array from which she was able to identify Tommy Garcia.
Between the victim's testimony, her cell phone, and DNA evidence that conclusively linked him to the crimes, there was no denying Tommy was the rapist. On July 26, 2013, after 2 days of testimony, Tommy Garcia was found guilty on both counts.
it was completely crazy that he definitely did it, that this was him. It was just unreal to believe.
It's a shocking thing to think somebody you've been married to is someone like that, a monster.
On the same day as the verdict, Tommy Garcia was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences and labeled a sexual predator. 7 months later, he pled guilty to the 3 other rape cases and received a 15-year sentence.
I felt like I was with somebody I never knew. I was devastated. I couldn't believe that I'd married somebody that was capable of something so horrible.
Knowing the awful truth about her husband, Crystal couldn't help but wonder if there were even more victims out there.
The times when he was having car problems, I wonder if there was more to it.
And she could barely stomach thinking of the young girls he had flirted with.
I worry that when he looked at other young people that maybe he had ulterior motives.
It's really unusual for someone who rapes to not have a history of other kind of violent or aggressive behavior. But we are not surprised to find that there may be others, and we have to hope others who have been their victims will come forward.
Seems just so unreal that he was somebody that I lived with. You know, you lock your doors every night and try to keep the bad people out, and really, I just locked the bad person in.
Today, Crystal still struggles with why her husband would suddenly choose such a dark path after 6 years of marriage.
There weren't any signs. He had a good family. He was good for so long, but something was wrong. Something snapped inside of him. I don't think I'll ever have all the answers.
He had everyone fooled. My parents, my grandparents, the whole family.
But Crystal is determined to put all the painful memories behind her.
I now wonder, do you ever really know somebody? But I'm doing good, and the boys are happy. My life is going in the right direction.
The concept of a courtroom is fundamentally built upon the premise of resolution, a sanctuary where the chaotic and often violent grievances of the outside world are brought to be measured, weighed, and ultimately settled by the blind scales of justice. It is a place where the primal urge for retribution is supposed to be neutralized by the sterile, procedural application of the law. People walk into these halls carrying the heaviest burdens of their lives, expecting that the architecture of the legal system will be strong enough to contain their fury and their sorrow. On the morning of July the 22nd, 2010, the Fagatogo High Court in the United States territory of American Samoa stood as exactly such a bastion of order. It was a stiflingly hot tropical morning, the kind of day where the heavy, humid air seems to press against the concrete and glass of the buildings, making the air-conditioned, wood-paneled interior of the courtroom feel like a completely isolated universe. Inside this insulated space, a highly anticipated trial regarding a severe and brutal assault was reaching its definitive conclusion. The atmosphere within the room was incredibly dense, suffocating under the weight of anticipation as the attendees awaited the final word of the court. When the wooden gavel struck the sounding block, the sharp, dry crack reverberated through the silent room like a physical shock wave. That single, percussive sound signaled the absolute end of the legal proceedings. The verdict was delivered, echoing across the tense space and cementing an outcome that would immediately alter the trajectory of every single person present in that building. The defendant in the severe assault case, a man who had been facing the terrifying prospect of severe penal consequences, was found entirely not guilty. The pronouncement of an acquittal is a profoundly polarizing moment in any judicial setting. For one side of the aisle, it is the ultimate exhalation, the sudden release of a crushing weight. The acquitted man physically reacted to the words, letting out a long, shuddering breath of relief. A subtle, quiet smile began to form on his face, a natural human response to the sudden realization that his freedom had been preserved. He had walked into the building a man in jeopardy, and he was now preparing to walk out as a man cleared of all charges by the highest authority in the territory. However, across the very same room, the atmosphere was undergoing a dark and violent transformation. The legal resolution that brought relief to the defendant served as an unbearable catalyst for another man in the gallery. Sitting among the attendees was Siamo Jr., a middle-aged man recognized throughout the territory as a highly influential and powerful local figure. His presence alone carried weight, tied to deep local roots and significant social standing within the community. For Siamo, the declaration of complete acquittal was not a demonstration of justice being served, but rather a catastrophic failure of the system, a personal affront that shattered his entire understanding of right and wrong. As the defendant's quiet smile of relief blossomed, a visceral and terrifying physical reaction overtook Siamo. The skin of his face tightened, his eyes darkened, losing all warmth and filling instead with a cold, absolute fury. The thick veins corded along his neck began to bulge prominently against his skin, pulsing with the rapid, adrenaline-fueled beating of his heart. The court had spoken. The legal system had finalized its decree. But in the mind of this powerful local figure, the matter was entirely unresolved. He refused to accept the outcome. He refused to let the final word belong to the judge sitting on the elevated bench. Driven by a sudden, overwhelming surge of rage and an absolute rejection of the judicial process, Siamo stood up from his seat. The abrupt movement tore through the lingering silence of courtroom. He turned his back on the judge, the acquitted defendant, and the very concept of the law, and began to march toward the exit. Every step he took was heavy, purposeful, and laden with a terrifying determination. The hard soles of his shoes struck the polished granite floors of the courtroom hallway in a rapid, rhythmic cadence that echoed off the high ceilings. The sound of his departure was not the retreat of a defeated man, but rather the ominous, driving percussion of a man who had just made a horrific decision. He was leaving the confines of the legal system not to walk away, but to rewrite the ending of the trial on his own terms. As he pushed through the heavy doors and stepped out into the oppressive, humid heat of the tropical morning, the contrast between the orderly quiet of the courtroom and the chaotic storm brewing inside him could not have been starker. He walked purposefully across the pavement toward the parking area, his mind locked into a singular, devastating trajectory. Reaching his vehicle, he did not get into the driver's seat to leave the grounds. Instead, he moved directly to the rear of the car and opened the trunk. In that fleeting moment, looking down into the storage space of his vehicle, Siamo crossed an invisible but insurmountable threshold, the frustration of a citizen morphing seamlessly into the calculated intent of an executioner. He reached inside and retrieved a firearm. By taking hold of that weapon, he was making a definitive choice to shatter the peace of the island, to usurp the authority of the court, and to impose his own lethal version of justice upon the people inside the building he had just departed. He concealed the weapon, closing the trunk with a decisive finality, and turned back toward the imposing structure of the Fagatogo High Court. Completely isolated from the terrifying escalation unfolding in the parking lot, the main lobby of the courthouse remained a picture of mundane, everyday law enforcement routine. Standing guard near the main entrance was Detective Lieutenant Lucilla Brown. Lieutenant Brown was a deeply respected veteran of the police force, a man whose very presence commanded a natural sense of authority and calm. He possessed a large, imposing physical build that naturally deterred trouble, but this formidable stature was entirely softened by a remarkably kind and gentle face. He was a fixture in the law enforcement community, a man who had dedicated a significant portion of his life to maintaining the peace and serving the citizens of the territory. On this particular morning, his duties placed him at the front line of courthouse security. He was standing casually, engaged in relaxed conversation with two of his fellow police officers. They were simply doing their jobs, providing a visible security presence, ensuring the orderly flow of people in and out of the halls of justice, entirely unaware that the most dangerous threat in the history of their department was currently walking toward the glass doors of their lobby. To understand the profound tragedy and the sheer, unadulterated terror of what was about to happen next, one must understand the unique and critical context of law enforcement protocols in the territory of American Samoa at that specific point in time. In the year 2010, the local laws governing the police force were rooted in a deeply traditional, community-focused philosophy of policing. The regulations strictly prohibited standard patrol officers and courthouse security personnel from carrying lethal firearms while on regular duty. The prevailing belief was that the authority of the uniform, the respect commanded by the badge, and the presence of non-lethal deterrence would be entirely sufficient to handle any disturbances that might arise on a relatively peaceful island. Therefore, as Lieutenant Brown and his two colleagues stood guard at the main entrance, their heavy black duty belts were glaringly hollow. They possessed only standard-issue batons and metal handcuffs. They were tasked with the immense responsibility of protecting the judges, the lawyers, the citizens, and the integrity of the judicial system itself. Yet they were deliberately deprived of the fundamental tools required to defend against a deadly, armed threat. It was a structural vulnerability born from a desire for a peaceful society, a legislative blind spot that assumed the absolute worst of human nature would never cross the threshold of their courts. This staggering disparity in power was about to violently collide with the reality of Siamo's rage. The veteran detective, with his kind face and unarmed belt, represented a system that believed it was safe. The enraged local figure, walking back toward the building with a hidden firearm, represented the chaotic, unpredictable violence that the law is designed to suppress but can never truly eliminate. The distance between the two men was rapidly shrinking. With every heavy step Siamo took back toward the entrance, the illusion of safety within the Fagatogo High Court was crumbling. The thick tropical air outside offered no warning, and the heavy glass doors of the lobby provided no meaningful barrier against the impending devastation. Inside, Lieutenant Brown continued his conversation, a dedicated public servant standing firmly on the front line, entirely oblivious to the fact that the legal system he swore to protect had just failed to satisfy a dangerous man, and that he, an officer stripped of the ability to shoot back, was standing directly in the path of the devastating consequences. The peaceful morning, the relief of the acquitted man, the heavy granite floors, and the unarmed guardians of the court were all about to be violently consumed by an act of unprecedented brutality that would force the island to reckon with its most fundamental laws regarding protection of those who protect and serve. The transition from absolute, mundane tranquility to unfathomable terror rarely comes with a warning. In the movies, there is a swelling score, a shift in lighting, a dramatic pause that alerts everyone to the impending doom. But in the cold, unyielding reality of life, violence simply arrives, tearing through the fabric of the ordinary with a brutal and indifferent suddenness. Inside the main lobby of the Fagatogo High Court, the atmosphere was entirely devoid of any such cinematic warnings. The lobby was a transitional space, an architectural buffer zone, designed to bridge the gap between chaotic heat of the island outside and the solemn, air-conditioned chambers of justice within. Its high ceilings, polished white walls, and heavy glass entryways were meant to project an aura of institutional authority and calm. Citizens passed through here every day, carrying their disputes, their anxieties, and their hopes, completely trusting in the unspoken promise that this building was a sanctuary. It was within this specific environment, bathed in the artificial glow of fluorescent lights and the filtered morning sun, that Detective Lieutenant Lucilla Brown stood his post. He was a man whose very presence seemed to anchor the room. With his large, imposing frame and a face that was universally recognized for its genuine kindness, he was the embodiment of community policing. He stood near the security podium, a structure meant to be the first line of defense, casually conversing with two fellow officers. They were relaxed, their postures reflecting the routine nature of a morning that had, up until this exact fraction of a second, offered absolutely no reason for alarm. They were guardians of a peace they believed was fundamentally secure. To comprehend the profound horror of the 30 seconds that followed, one must intimately understand a fatal vulnerability that was strapped to the waists of these three men. In any standard law enforcement scenario across most of the world, a police officer's duty belt is a heavy, complex piece of equipment, anchoring their authority with the ultimate, lethal equalizer. But here, in the territory of American Samoa in the year 2010, a deeply ingrained cultural and legal philosophy dictated a different reality. The law strictly prohibited regular patrol officers and courthouse security from carrying firearms. The belts worn by Lieutenant Brown and his colleagues were heavy with the tools of compliance, but completely devoid of the tools of survival against a deadly threat. Attached to the thick black leather were metal handcuffs, intended to restrain subjects who had already surrendered. There were rigid batons, designed to subdue physical altercations. There were radios to call for backup. But the space where a holster should have rested, the space where a firearm should have offered a definitive countermeasure to extreme violence, was terrifyingly empty. This legislative decision was born from a noble, perhaps naive, belief in the inherent peace of the island community, a belief that the uniform itself would be enough to deter the ultimate acts of malice. It was a legal framework that demanded these officers stand between the innocent and the dangerous, while systematically denying them the ability to match lethal force with lethal force. They were walking paradoxes of authority, projecting power while harboring a devastating, state-mandated weakness. This catastrophic intersection of unarmed authority and unrestrained malice materialized as the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open. Siamo Jr. stepped across the threshold, bringing the suffocating heat of the parking lot and the dark, violent storm of his own rage into the sterile environment of the courthouse. To the casual observer, he might have just looked like another citizen returning to the building, perhaps a man frustrated by a delay or misplaced document. His walk was purposeful, his face set in a rigid, unreadable mask, but the true indicator of his horrific intent was hidden from immediate view. His right hand was unnaturally concealed, tucked deep within the folds of his clothing, gripping the cold, hard steel of the firearm he had just retrieved from his vehicle. The architecture of the lobby inadvertently facilitated his ambush. There were no metal detectors at that specific perimeter, no reinforced barriers to slow his approach. The space between the enraged man and the unsuspecting officers was an open, unobstructed expanse of polished floor. The psychological concept of fatal funnel often describes a narrow passageway where threats are concentrated, but in this moment, the entire lobby became a funnel of time and distance rapidly collapsing toward a singularity of violence. 5 meters. At this distance, The human brain is still processing ordinary social cues. Lieutenant Brown and his colleagues were still engaged in their conversation, their eyes perhaps registering a figure entering the building. But their threat assessment instincts, dulled by years of relative peace and the artificial security of the courthouse, did not immediately trigger an alarm. The mind desperately clings to normalcy, filtering out anomalies until they become impossible to ignore. Sialmo's pace did not falter. He did not issue a threat. He did not shout a warning. He simply closed the gap with the terrifying momentum of a predator locked onto its prey. 3 meters. At this proximity, the subtle, unnatural tension in Sialmo's posture became glaringly evident. The concealment of his right hand was no longer a casual resting position. It was a deliberate, rigid hiding of an imminent threat. The officer's peripheral vision began to catch the wrongness of the approaching figure. The relaxed atmosphere of the lobby began to fracture, the air growing suddenly dense with the unspoken realization that something was terribly amiss. But human reaction time is tragically slow when measured against the speed of premeditated violence. Before the officers could fully pivot, before their brains could send the urgent, desperate signals to their muscles to adopt a defensive stance, the distance evaporated. 1 meter, the threshold of intimacy, the distance at which a conversation is held, was violated by the sudden, aggressive motion of Sialmo's right arm violently pulling free from the fabric of his clothing. The concealment was shattered, replaced by the stark, terrifying geometry of a raised firearm. The black metal of the weapon was the focal point of the room, a sudden, alien object introduced into a space defined by legal procedure. In that microscopic fraction of a second, the illusion of the Fagatogo High Court as an impenetrable sanctuary was completely and irreversibly destroyed. There was no time for negotiation. There was no time to draw a baton or reach for a radio. There was only the sudden, blinding eruption of muzzle flash. The concussive shock wave of the first gunshot detonated within the enclosed lobby like a physical blow. The sound was an unnatural, deafening roar that slammed against the polished walls and high ceilings, violently overriding every other auditory input in the building. It was not a pop, but a catastrophic tearing of the air, a sound that inherently communicates absolute destruction. The muzzle of the gun flared with intense, brief incandescence, illuminating the grim determination on Sialmo's face and the sudden, dawning comprehension on the face of his target. Lieutenant Lucilla Brown, standing at point-blank range, had absolutely no margin for evasion. The kinetic energy of the projectile struck his large frame with devastating force. The human body, regardless of its strength or the authority it represents, is tragically fragile when subjected to ballistics of a firearm. The physical impact was immediate and catastrophic, a violent trauma that instantly overwhelmed the system. A second shot followed the first with sickening rapidity, then a third. The mechanical, ruthless efficiency of the weapon was a stark contrast to the vulnerable flesh and blood it was destroying. The air filled with a sharp, acrid smell of burning gunpowder, a chemical signature of the violence that was rapidly unfolding. Hot brass casings, ejected from the firearm, spun through the air and struck the granite floor with sharp, chaotic pings that were barely audible beneath the echoing roar of the gunfire. Lieutenant Brown, a beloved veteran, a pillar of his community, and a dedicated guardian of the peace, could not withstand the assault. His body shuddered under the consecutive impacts. The strength evaporated from his legs, and he collapsed heavily, his large frame falling toward the polished floor he had been standing upon just seconds prior. He struck the ground at the base of the security podium, a horrific, expanding pool of deep red blood immediately beginning to stain the pristine surface of the lobby. He fell without having had the slightest opportunity to defend himself, an unarmed man executed in the very hall of justice he was sworn to protect. For the 2 remaining officers standing mere feet away, the psychological shock was unfathomable. The human mind experiences severe trauma in fragments, time stretching and distorting as the brain struggles to process an impossible reality. 1 second, they were casually speaking with their mentor and friend. The next, they were deafened by the roar of a gun, blinded by the muzzle flashes, and watching that same friend bleed out onto the granite. In the immediate panic aftermath of the first volley, survival instincts overrode all conscious thought. The natural, ingrained response of any police officer witnessing a lethal threat is to immediately return fire, to neutralize the active shooter and protect the innocent. Their hands instinctively, desperately slapped down toward their hips, their muscle memories searching for familiar grip of a service weapon to draw and engage the murderer standing in front of them. But their hands met only the smooth, unyielding leather of their belts and the cold, useless metal of their handcuffs. The realization that crashed over them was a nightmare made flesh. They were trapped in a confined space with a highly motivated, completely unrestrained active shooter, and they were entirely, hopelessly unarmed. The state had sent them into a war zone with nothing but sticks. The absolute, crushing helplessness of that specific realization is almost impossible to articulate. They were looking at a man who was casually holding the power of life and death, and they possessed absolutely no mechanical means to stop him. The panic in the lobby exploded. The screams of the civilians who had been nearby tore through the ringing in their ears, pure, visceral shrieks of terror as the reality of the active shooter situation registered. People scrambled frantically, diving for cover behind wooden benches and marble pillars, desperate to escape the line of fire. Yet, in the face of this absolute, terrifying disadvantage, the two unarmed officers did not flee. They did not dive for cover alongside the civilians they were sworn to protect. In a display of raw, almost incomprehensible courage born from absolute desperation, they chose to engage, stripped of their firearms, denied the basic tools of their trade by a flawed legal statute. They realized that the only weapons they had left were their own bodies. With their friend dead on the floor and the shooter pivoting to find new targets, the two officers lunged forward. They charged a man holding a smoking gun with nothing but their bare hands in the desperate, frantic hope that they could physically overwhelm him before he pulled the trigger again. Cialmo, however, was not finished. The rage that had propelled him out of the courtroom had not been sated by the murder of Lieutenant Brown. Seeing the two officers charging toward him, he simply swung the barrel of his weapon in their direction. His movements were frantic but devastatingly effective. The gun roared again, the concussive blast continuing to shatter the chaos of the lobby. He fired at point-blank range into the charging men. The bullets tore through their uniforms, striking flesh and bone. The momentum of their desperate charge was violently arrested by the kinetic force of the projectiles. Blood sprayed outward, bright and horrific, splattering violently across the stark white walls of the courthouse lobby, creating macabre, chaotic patterns that stood in stark contrast to the ordered, institutional environment. The physical trauma was overwhelming. The two officers, critically wounded, their bodies failing under severe damage inflicted by the gunfire, collapsed onto the slick, blood-stained floor. The pain must have been blinding, their nervous system screaming in agony. Yet, the sheer force of their will, their desperate determination to stop the man who had just executed their colleague, refused to be extinguished. As they hit the floor, bleeding heavily and unable to stand, they continued to fight. They dragged their broken bodies across the granite, ignoring the catastrophic injuries they had just sustained. In a final, heartbreaking display of duty, they reached out with their bare, bloodied hands, desperately clutching and grabbing at Cialmo's legs. They wrapped their arms around his ankles, trying to anchor him to the floor, tried to use their own dying weight to prevent him from taking another step, from finding another victim. It was a chaotic, bloody struggle on the floor of the Fagatogo High Court, a stark, agonizing visual representation of the absolute failure of the system. Two men bleeding out, using their fingernails and their fading strength to wrestle with a murderer, while their empty duty belts hung uselessly at their waists. They were sacrificing their lives, offering up their own flesh to compensate for the deadly void in the territory's law enforcement legislation, embodying the most tragic and heroic definition of serving and protecting in a situation where they had been entirely left defenseless. The wailing of ambulance sirens tore through the heavy tropical rain, a piercing mechanical scream that shattered whatever remained of the morning's fragile peace. The storm outside seemed to mirror the catastrophic violence that had just unfolded within the normally pristine walls of the Fagatogo High Court. Water lashed against the heavy glass doors, washing away the humidity, but utterly failing to cleanse the horrific scene inside the lobby. First responders rushed through the entrance, their heavy boots slipping on the blood-slicked granite floor that had become a gruesome testament to a profound systemic failure. They were met with a scene of unimaginable devastation, a nightmare painted in stark, violent hues across the architecture of justice. The medical personnel worked with frantic, desperate energy, their hands stained crimson as they attempted to stabilize the critically wounded officers who had fought so valiantly with nothing but their bare hands. Yet, despite their most fervent efforts, the reality of the trauma inflicted by the point-blank gunfire was insurmountable. The life of Detective Lieutenant Lucilla Brown, a man who had dedicated his existence to the safety of his community, had already slipped away on that cold floor, his massive heart stilled by the unfathomable rage of a man he had never wronged. The aftermath was not merely a physical cleanup. Though the visual of custodians silently scrubbing dried blood from the white walls days later would haunt the collective memory of the island for generations, it was a profound, agonizing reckoning with the reality that the territory of American Samoa had desperately tried to ignore. The island community was plunged into a state of collective shock and profound mourning. The death of a police officer is a tragedy in any jurisdiction, but the execution of an unarmed guardian within the very halls designed to uphold the law struck at the foundational core of their society. The grief rapidly metamorphosed into a searing, undeniable anger directed at the legislative framework that had mandated such a fatal vulnerability. The empty holsters of the fallen officers became a potent, undeniable symbol of legislative negligence. The blood spilled in the courthouse lobby was a direct consequence of a romanticized view of island peace that willfully ignored the brutal potential of human malice. The government of the territory was forced into a state of intense, uncomfortable introspection. The halls of the Legislative Assembly, normally places of measured debate and procedural decorum, erupted into scenes of agonizing tension. Politicians and lawmakers, confronted by the undeniable consequences of their outdated statutes, engaged in fierce, emotionally charged arguments. Fists pounded against heavy wooden desks, mirroring the desperate struggle that had taken place in courthouse. The debate was no longer an abstract philosophical discussion about community policing versus militarization. It was a visceral, desperate scramble to rectify a fatal error, driven by the haunting realization that they had sent their protectors into line of fire completely defenseless. The tragedy served as a devastating catalyst required to shatter the long-standing resistance to arming the local police force. The government, burdened by the immense weight of Lieutenant Brown's sacrifice, was compelled to draft and pass new legislation, fundamentally altering the nature of law enforcement on the island to ensure the officers tasked with confronting the most dangerous elements of society would never again be forced to do so with empty hands. While the political landscape of the territory underwent a seismic shift, the machinery of the criminal justice system turned its full, uncompromising weight toward the man responsible for the massacre. The apprehension of Siamo Jr. was not the end of the ordeal, but rather the beginning of a complex and deeply frustrating legal labyrinth. The prosecution approached the case with singular, unyielding determination to secure the ultimate punishment for a crime of such unprecedented brutality. The murder of a police officer, combined with the attempted murder of two others and the brazen assault on the judicial system itself, demanded the absolute maximum penalty available under the law. The local government and the grieving community were united in their desire to see the shooter face execution, viewing it as the only proportionate response to the sheer magnitude of the violence. However, as the legal proceedings slowly advanced, a glaring, almost incomprehensible loophole within the territorial legal framework was laid bare. The prosecutors discovered a paradoxical flaw in their pursuit of capital punishment. While the Penal Code of American Samoa technically allowed for the imposition of the death penalty on paper, the territory completely lacked any official, constitutionally approved method for carrying out the execution. There was no lethal injection protocol established, no electric chair constructed, no firing squad authorized by the local statutes. It was a bizarre and infuriating legal twilight zone where the ultimate punishment existed as a theoretical concept, but was practically impossible to execute. The prosecution found themselves trapped by the very legal system they were attempting to defend, facing a murderer whose life they want to claim, but lacking the legal machinery to do so. This constitutional gap added a layer of profound agony to the already agonizing process, forcing the families of the victims and the surviving officers to endure a prolonged, painful realization that the retribution they sought was legally unattainable. The bureaucratic delays, the endless legal maneuvering, and the struggle to navigate this unprecedented constitutional hurdle stretched the agonizing process out over an excruciating period of 6 long years. The Fagatogo High Court, the very building that had witnessed the horrific bloodshed, was forced to play host to the prolonged, procedural aftermath of its own desecration. The community watched, exhausted and traumatized, as the years ticked by, the memory of the gunfire slowly fading from the immediate physical environment, but remaining permanently etched into their psychological landscape. It was not until the year 2016 that the sprawling, painful legal saga finally reached its unavoidable conclusion. The courtroom was once again packed, the air thick with the accumulated weight of 6 years of grief, anger, and the desperate yearning for closure. The space was heavily guarded, the visible presence of armed security a stark, silent testament to the bloody lesson learned in that very building. When the presiding judge finally delivered the sentence, there was no dramatic climax, only a heavy, exhausting finality. The inability to execute the defendant forced the court to impose the most severe alternative available. The gavel struck the sounding block, a haunting echo of the sound that had initially triggered the violence 6 years prior. Siamo Jr. was officially condemned to spend the remainder of his natural life within the confines of a maximum security prison cell, entirely stripped of any possibility of parole, commutation, or release. The legal system, crippled by its own contradictions, had managed to secure a permanent exile from society, ensuring that the man who had brought such unimaginable terror to their shores would never again walk as a free citizen. The transition from the chaotic violence of the courthouse lobby to the sterile, absolute confinement of a prison cell is a journey from explosion to entropy. Inside the heavily fortified walls of the penitentiary, the narrative of the once powerful local figure dissolved into a terrifying, suffocating silence. A high-angle perspective looking down into the narrow, dimly lit space of the cell reveals the ultimate, crushing reality of his punishment. The man sitting on the edge of the rigid metal cot is barely recognizable as the enraged, formidable presence who had stormed through the courthouse doors. The passage of 6 years in absolute isolation has systematically stripped away his aura of invincibility. The harsh, unforgiving light from the single bulb casts deep shadows across his face, highlighting the deep lines of premature aging and the stark, undeniable graying of his hair. He wears a standard, drab uniform of the condemned, a fabric that signifies the complete erasure of his former identity and status. There is no movement in the cell, no sound other than the distant metallic echoing of the prison block. The air is stagnant, heavy with the weight of decades yet to be lived in this exact, unchanging environment. The crushing realization emphasizes the agonizing claustrophobia of his existence. He is a man trapped not just by thick concrete walls and heavy steel bars, but by the inescapable, crushing weight of his own actions. Every single day, he must wake to the exact same gray reality, left alone with the memories of the blood on the granite floor and the realization that his momentary explosion of rage cost him his entire future. The government may have lacked the means to execute him, but they possess the absolute power to bury him alive within the architecture of the penal system. The legacy of the Fagatogo High Court shooting extends far beyond the confines of that single prison cell. The territory of American Samoa was permanently scarred, forced to abandon its innocence and confront the darkest aspects of human nature. The heavy armed belts worn by the police officers patrolling the streets today serve as a constant, sobering reminder of the price paid for their current security. The sacrifice of Detective Lieutenant Lucilla Brown remains a solemn cornerstone of their law enforcement history, his memory honored not through vengeance, but through the vital, systemic changes enacted to protect those who stand the line. The echoes of the gunfire have long since faded into the tropical breeze, replaced by the quiet, vigilant hum of society that learned the hardest possible lesson about vulnerability, justice, and the devastating consequences of an empty holster. The scales of justice were ultimately balanced, not with sudden drop, but with the slow, agonizing, and entirely silent suffocation of a lifetime spent alone in the dark. The aftermath of the Fagatogo High Court shooting was not merely a conclusion, but the genesis of a rigorous, painful, and necessary investigative autopsy of the entire legal and protective framework of American Samoa. When the dust finally settled and the tragic silence of the aftermath replaced the cacophony of sirens, the focus shifted from the visceral horror of the crime to the cold, analytical examination of the systemic failures that allowed it to occur. Investigators and legal scholars were tasked with reconstructing the timeline, not just of the massacre itself, but the policy decisions, the institutional inertia, and the cultural assumptions that had created the environment for such a tragedy. This forensic investigation into the structural integrity of the territory security apparatus became a shadow trial of its own, where the evidence collected was not just ballistic reports or witness testimonies, but the history of legislative debates, administrative memos, and the pervasive, idealized perception of safety that had clouded the judgment of the territory's leaders for decades. The investigative process began with a deep dive into the specific tactical environment of the courthouse. Investigators spent weeks meticulously analyzing the lobby's layout, studying the movement patterns of both the public and the security details. They scrutinized the standard operating procedures that had been in place on that fateful July morning, looking for the fissures in the protocols that Cialmo Jr. had exploited with such deadly precision. It was not enough to know how he did it. They had to understand why the security apparatus was so thoroughly unequipped to intercept him. They interviewed every individual who had been present in the courtroom, from the judges who had presided over the acquittal to the clerk who had been transcribing the proceedings. Each testimony was a piece of a larger, darker puzzle, detailing the growing tension within a room as the verdict was delivered, and the terrifying speed at which the atmosphere shifted from legal formality to lethal chaos. These interviews were grueling, forcing witnesses to relive the most traumatic moment of their lives, but they were essential to documenting the sheer absence of protective measures that had left Lieutenant Brown and his colleagues essentially defenseless. Parallel to the factual reconstruction of the crime, a secondary investigation was launched into the legal history of the territory's armament statutes. Researchers delved into decades of legislative archives, tracing the origin of the laws that had stripped police officers of their sidearms. They found that these policies were not the result of a single, sudden legislative whim, but rather the cumulative effect of a deeply held, almost romanticized belief in the community-based, non-violent character of the Samoan people. The investigation revealed that for years, despite growing evidence that crime was becoming more complex and violent, there had been a stubborn, persistent resistance to acknowledging the necessity of lethal force in law enforcement. The institutional mindset had been trapped in a time capsule, clinging to a traditionalist vision of policing that prioritized the symbolic authority of the uniform over the practical reality of modern threats. This administrative stagnation was identified as a critical point of failure, a failure of imagination and responsibility that had allowed the police force to become woefully obsolete in the face of a changing world. As the investigative findings were compiled, the focus intensified on the actions of the officers involved. While the official narrative correctly identified them as victims of a failed system, the professional investigation required a granular analysis of their response. The investigators reviewed security footage that had captured the lobby's destruction frame by agonizing frame. They studied how the officers, upon being ambushed, had instinctively reached for weapons they did not possess. This analysis was not intended to judge the officers, whose bravery was universally recognized and beyond reproach, but to provide irrefutable evidence of the tactical catastrophe that occurs when an unarmed professional is forced to confront an armed aggressor. The findings were clinical and devastating. The total lack of defensive capability had resulted in a loss of life that could have been mitigated had the proper tools been provided. These reports were not just filed away. They were weaponized in the public and political sphere, used to confront the very lawmakers who had been most vocal in their opposition to police armament. Furthermore, the investigation extended to the judicial process itself. The acquittal that had acted as a catalyst for Cialmo's rampage was subjected to a thorough, if sensitive, review. While the integrity of the judicial decision remained independent of the violence that followed, the investigators looked at whether the court had received any threat assessments regarding the defendant or the atmosphere in the courtroom prior to verdict. The discovery that there had been a lack of proactive security screening for attendees, and that no intelligence had been shared regarding the potential volatility of the defendant's supporters, pointed to a critical failure in the cooperation between the judicial branch and the police department. This disconnect between the legal process and the protective services was highlighted as a significant gap in the territory's overall public safety strategy. The investigators argued that a courtroom is not just a place for legal debate. It is a high-risk environment that requires the same level of threat assessment as any other critical infrastructure. As the months passed and the investigative report were finalized, they were not buried in bureaucratic archives. Instead, they were utilized to dismantle the last remaining defenses of the status quo. The evidence was presented to a special committee, where the chilling, dispassionate analysis of the fatal gaps in the system provided the leverage needed for lasting change. The findings of the investigation became the bedrock upon which the new legislative framework was built. Every detail, from the lack of metal detectors to the absence of service weapons, was addressed in the new protocols. The investigation had not just solved a crime. It had dismantled the archaic, dangerous assumptions that had underpinned the island's policing strategy. It documented the cost of complacency in blood and trauma, creating a permanent, historical record that would forever serve as a warning. The process of investigation also facilitated a deeper, more personal form of reckoning. Many of the detectives who had been colleagues and friends of Lieutenant Brown led these inquiries. Their motivation was not just professional. It was deeply personal, an act of justice for a fallen brother in arms. Their dedication ensured that no detail was glossed over and that every legislative loophole was exposed. They worked to ensure that the memory of what happened in that lobby would be protected from being rewritten or forgotten. Their rigor in the investigation became a form of healing, a way for them to exert control over a situation that had been defined by chaos and powerlessness. By systematically dissecting the failures of that day, they were, in a sense, arming themselves with the truth, ensuring that the legislative changes that followed would be comprehensive, permanent, and impervious to the kind of institutional inertia that had led to the tragedy. The investigation eventually concluded that the Fagatogo High Court shooting was not just an act of individual malice by a powerful, unstable man, but the inevitable consequence of a system that had refused to acknowledge the reality of its own risks. It was a failure of the collective, a shared responsibility that started with the legislative refusal to arm, trickled down through the administrative failure to update security protocols, and culminated in the tragic, defenseless reality experienced by the officers in the lobby. The investigative documents served as a final indictment of a previous era. They detailed, with surgical precision, how a lack of foresight had created a vacuum where violence was able to thrive. When the final pages of the investigative report were turned, they left behind a clear, irrefutable mandate for the future, that the safety of the public and the security of those who serve must never again be compromised by an outdated or misguided ideal of peace. The work was done. The failures have been meticulously cataloged, and the lessons have been etched into the very foundation of the new security infrastructure. This comprehensive, exhaustive inquiry ensured that the legacy of the tragedy would not be one of senseless victimhood, but one of transformation, driven by the cold, hard truths unearthed from the rubble of a shattered system. The investigation turned the light of accountability onto every corner of the failure, leaving nothing to chance and ensuring that the territory of American Samoa would enter a new, more realistic, and more secure chapter of its history, protected by a system that finally recognized the necessity of being prepared for the worst. The procedural journey toward justice for the victims of the Fagatogo High Court shooting was an ordeal that tested the very resilience of the legal system in American Samoa. Following the harrowing events of that July morning, the initial phase was defined by the raw, kinetic urgency of law enforcement mobilizing to secure the crime scene and launch a comprehensive criminal investigation. Detective work, under normal circumstances, involves the slow, methodical accumulation of evidence, witness statements, and forensic data, but this case demanded a speed and precision that strained the local resources. The crime scene, the lobby of the High Court, was effectively frozen in time, treated as the most critical piece of evidence in the territory's history. Investigators meticulously processed every square inch of the granite floor, marking the positions of spent casings, tracing the trajectory of bullets that had shattered the glass and marred the white walls, and carefully documenting the location where Lieutenant Lucilla Brown and his colleagues had fallen. This forensic meticulousness was not merely for the sake of the trial. It was a profound act of respect for the victims, a way of ensuring that their final moments of courageous struggle were understood and honored with absolute clarity. The suspect, Sialmo Jr., was taken into custody shortly after the shooting, his apprehension marking the start of a labyrinthine judicial process. The charges filed against him were the most grave and severe nature: murder in the first degree, multiple counts of attempted murder, and various firearm-related offenses. The prosecution, spearheaded by a team of determined local attorneys, recognized from the outset that this case would redefine the legal landscape of the territory. They were tasked with building a case that was not only legally airtight, but also emotionally resonant, one that could withstand the scrutiny of a high-profile trial while navigating the complex cultural nuances of the island. Every piece of evidence, from a firearm recovered from the parking lot to the recorded footage of the lobby, was prepared with the intent to present an undeniable narrative of premeditated, unprovoked, and cold-blooded violence. The prosecution understood that they were not just trying a man for his crimes, but were also effectively putting the territorial legal system on trial, forcing a reckoning with how such a catastrophic failure of security could have been permitted to occur. As the case moved through the initial hearings, the defense mounted a strategy that was expected, a focus on the defendant's state of mind at the time of the shooting, attempting to mitigate the culpability of his actions through narratives of extreme provocation or psychological distress. However, the sheer evidence of his actions, the premeditated retrieval of the weapon from his vehicle, the calm deliberation with which he returned to the building, and the focused, lethal manner in which he engaged the officers, made such arguments profoundly difficult to sustain. The courtroom became a stage for a grueling intellectual and emotional combat. The families of the victims, the surviving officers, and the witnesses who had been present in the lobby were forced to relive their trauma through the sterile, repetitive questioning of the legal teams. The judicial environment, usually defined by its detached objectivity, was strained by the heavy atmosphere of collective grief and the simmering public anger that permeated every session. The prosecution's case was anchored by the testimonies of survivors, the two officers who, despite having been critically wounded, had managed to crawl across the floor to attempt the restraint of the gunman. Their presence in the courtroom, bearing the visible and invisible scars of that day, was the most powerful testament to the reality of the crime. They did not speak in abstract terms of legal duty. They recounted the raw, physical agony of being shot, the crushing helplessness of being unarmed, and the singular, desperate focus of their survival instinct. Their testimony dismantled any attempt by the defense to frame the defendant's actions as anything other than a deliberate, heinous attack on the symbols of law and order. The judges and the jury were forced to confront the reality that these officers had faced a mortal threat that they had been systematically denied the tools to mitigate. This aspect of the trial became an unofficial audit of the legislative failure, providing a living, breathing demonstration of why the territory's laws had to change. The defense, meanwhile, attempted to challenge the procedural aspect of the case, filing motions that prolonged the pretrial phase and added to the cumulative weight of the experience for all involved. They scrutinized a collection of forensic evidence, the chain of custody for the recovered weapon, and the methodology of the investigation, hoping to find any procedural irregularity that could serve as a leverage point. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the integrity of the crime scene processing had been beyond reproach, leaving very little room for such maneuvers. The trial was not a debate about whether crime had occurred. It was a demonstration of the legal system's capacity to process the most extreme manifestations of human evil. The judicial branch, often criticized for its slow pace, was now under intense public pressure to deliver a verdict that would finally provide some semblance of closure to a wounded community. The pivotal moment in the judicial process came with the realization that the territory's laws regarding capital punishment were fundamentally unequipped for the realities of the crime. The prosecution's desire to see the defendant pay the ultimate price, a desire shared by a significant portion of the populace, hit an impenetrable constitutional wall. This discovery transformed the trial from a simple pursuit of justice into an existential examination of the territory's identity and its legal maturity. It became a lesson in the complexity of law, that it is not enough to declare an act punishable by death. There must exist a clear, humane, and constitutional pathway to effectuate that punishment. The absence of this pathway was not just an administrative oversight. It was a profound failure of the law to provide for the most serious of its own mandates. This reality, articulated clearly within the courtroom, forced the public to accept that their desire for immediate, definitive retribution could not be satisfied by the mechanisms currently at their disposal. The final verdict, delivered after years of procedural delay, was a somber culmination of the trial. The judge, in delivering the sentence of life without the possibility of parole, acknowledged the depth of the suffering caused by the defendant's actions and the necessity of ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to threaten the safety of others. The sentence was not a victory in the sense that it could restore what had been lost, but it was a definitive resolution of the legal process. The defendant's removal from society, his permanent confinement in the depths of the correctional system, was the only instrument of justice the system could wield with absolute certainty. As the proceedings concluded, the courtroom emptied, leaving behind a silence that felt different than it had before. The legal system had fulfilled its primary function. It had held an individual accountable for his actions, but in doing so, it had also laid bare the vulnerabilities, the gaps, and profound, systemic shortcomings that had allowed the tragedy to manifest in the first place. This judicial experience served as a permanent, indelible lesson for the legal community of American Samoa. The trial became the standard by which all future cases of serious criminal violence would be measured. It emphasized the absolute necessity of rigorous procedural standards, the importance of robust security protocols in the judicial environment, and the need for legislative frameworks that are not only sound in principle, but practically actionable in the face of extreme criminal acts. The case left a legacy of professionalization, pushing the legal and law enforcement sectors to adopt more sophisticated, modern approaches to threat assessment and risk management. The memory of the trial and the resulting verdict became part of the territory's legal history, a chapter that documented the price of its former complacency and the arduous, painful process of evolving into a system that was finally capable of providing both justice and protection for its citizens. The court had held its ground, the law had been applied, and the individual responsible for the collapse of peace had been permanently isolated from the society he had so violently attacked. But the echoes of those proceedings would continue to resonate in the halls of the Fagatogo High Court for decades to come, reminding everyone of the heavy cost of justice in a world that can never be assumed to be entirely safe. The passage of time is a peculiar way of smoothing over the sharpest edges of tragedy, turning the chaotic terror of a single morning into a historical landmark, a point of reference by which an entire community measures its existence. For the people of American Samoa, the date of July the 22nd, 2010, became a definitive fault line in their collective history, dividing their reality into a simpler, more innocent before and a vigilant, sober after. Prior to that fateful day, the territory had operated under a shared cultural compact, a belief that the close-knit nature of island life, bound by deep traditions of respect and community solidarity, served as an invisible shield against the worst excesses of modern societal violence. The police force, visible and approachable without the heavy accoutrements of lethal armament, embodied this philosophy perfectly, representing an extension of community rather than an occupying force of state authority. But when the echo of those point-blank gunshots finally faded into the tropical air of Fagatogo, that foundational illusion was shattered completely, leaving behind a society that had to hurriedly learn how to live with the realization that even their most sacred institutions were vulnerable to unbridled malice. The immediate shock eventually dissolved into a permanent, quiet shift in the psychological landscape of the island, a transformation that manifested not in sudden outbursts of fear, but in a quiet, pervasive understanding that safety is a fragile construct requiring constant material defense. The physical wounds inflicted upon the two surviving officers eventually healed, their bodies stitched back together by medical intervention, but the internal landscape of their survival remained a complex and heavy burden to carry. To survive an encounter where you are completely outmatched, where your state-mandated defenselessness forces you to use your own flesh as a barrier against supersonic lead, leave scars that no surgeon can ever fully reach. These men returned to a community that viewed them as heroes, and rightly so, yet the quiet reality of their daily lives was undoubtedly shaped by the persistent memory of the lobby floor, the smell of cordite, and the final moments of their fallen colleague. Their survival became a living testament to the sheer inadequacy of the system they had been sworn to uphold, a reminder that courage alone, no matter how profound or desperate, is an unfair substitute for practical tools of survival. As they moved forward, navigating their careers and their personal lives in the shadow of the shooting, their experiences remained a guiding force of the reforms that followed, ensuring that the raw data of the investigative reports was always anchored by the human reality of those who had lived through the nightmare. They carried the memory of Lieutenant Brown not as a distant historical figure, but as a brother whose absence left a permanent void in their lives, a loss that underscored every single day of their continued service. The most visible and enduring consequence of the tragedy was the fundamental transformation of the law enforcement uniform itself across the entire territory. For generations, the empty holster had been a point of pride, a symbol of an island that did not need to govern itself through the implicit threat of state-sanctioned violence. But in the years following the Fagatogo massacre, that pride was replaced by a grim, protective pragmatism, as lawmakers finally dismantled the prohibitions and equipped standard patrol officers with service firearms. This change was not merely operational. It was a profound cultural shift that altered the relationship between the citizenry and the police. The visual of an armed officer walking the streets or standing guard in the rebuilt lobby of the High Court served as a constant, daily reminder of the price that had been paid for this new standard of security. It was a visual admission that the world had changed, that the isolation of the island could no longer insulate from the global realities of criminal violence. The community had to adjust to this new aesthetic of authority, learning to see the holster firearm not as a threat to their traditional way of life, but as a necessary shield designed to ensure that no officer would ever again be forced to defend the public with empty hands. The legal gridlock that prevented the imposition of the death penalty also left a lingering, philosophical question in the minds of many who followed the case, highlighting the strange, sometimes frustrating paradoxes that exist within human structures of justice. The fact that a territory could possess a law allowing for the ultimate punishment on paper, yet remain completely incapable of executing it due to a lack of procedural mechanism, was an indictment of administrative oversight that added a layer of prolonged exhaustion to the community's grief. This loophole meant that the pursuit of justice was forced to bend to the reality of constitutional limitations, reminding society that the law is not an instrument of pure vengeance, but a highly rigid, bureaucratic machine that must operate within its own strict boundaries even when confronted with the most heinous crimes. This realization forced a collective maturation within the legal system of American Samoa, prompting scholars and legislators to look beyond the emotional demands for retribution and focus instead on building a legal architecture that was practical, cohesive, and fully prepared for any crisis. The sentence of life without parole eventually became accepted not as a compromise, but as a definitive, unyielding statement that society had the power to permanently erase a threat from its midst, choosing the quiet, absolute finality of confinement over the complicated spectacle of an unexecutable death sentence. At the heart of this entire historical narrative stands a memory of Detective Lieutenant Lucilla Brown, a man whose legacy is now inextricably bound to the evolution of public safety in his homeland. He is remembered by those who knew him not for the brutal manner of his death, but for the fullness of his life and the gentle, authoritative kindness he brought to his duties every single day. He was a pillar of the community, a veteran who represented the very best of what island policing was supposed to be: approachable, respected, and deeply embedded in the fabric of society he protected. The tragedy of his execution in the courthouse lobby did not diminish his contribution. Rather, it elevated his sacrifice into a catalyst for the preservation of future lives. The modern, armed, and highly trained police force that operates in American Samoa today stands as a living monument to his memory, an institutional shield built directly upon the foundation of his loss. His name is spoken with immense reverence within the halls of justice and the precincts of the police department, serving as a reminder of the ultimate stakes of the profession and the sacred duty owed to those who wear the badge. He did not seek to be a martyr, but his courage in the face of an unprecedented threat ensured that his final act was one of profound service, forcing an entire society to wake up and protect its protectors. In stark contrast to the enduring, active legacy of the victims and the systemic reforms they inspired, the fate of the perpetrator faded into a completely sterile, inconsequential silence. Within the maximum security facility where he is destined to spend the rest of his natural life, Siamo Jr. ceased to be an influential local figure or a catalyst for political debate. He became merely a number, an isolated soul confined to a repetitive, gray existence far removed from the vibrant life of the island he had terrorized. This absolute isolation is perhaps the most profound expression of the law's ultimate power, not the spectacular violence of an execution, but the slow, methodical, and total erasure of an individual from a collective consciousness of the world. While the territory rebuilt its institutions, updated its laws, and moved forward into a more secure future, his world permanently shrank to the dimensions of a concrete cell, bounded by the unchanging routine of institutional confinement. He was left with nothing but the silence of his thoughts and the permanent weight of his crimes, a stark demonstration that the violent eruption of rage which shattered the peace of Fagatogo ultimately achieved nothing but the total destruction of his own existence. The island moved on without him, the memory of his influence dissolving into the history books, leaving him entirely forgotten in the dark while the community he tried to fracture continued to heal and grow. Ultimately, the story of the Fagatogo High Court shooting is a narrative about the heavy price of awareness, a study in how society transitions from a state of comfortable, traditional innocence into the complex realities of modern public safety. It forces us to reflect on the delicate balance that every community must strike between maintaining a welcoming, open society and establishing the necessary, sometimes harsh measures required to protect that openness from destruction. The peace that American Samoa enjoys today is different from the peace it possessed before 2010. It is a peace that is vigilant, prepared, and fully aware of the potential for darkness that exists within the human heart. The halls of the High Court are quiet once again. The legal arguments are presented, and the verdicts are delivered with the same procedural solemnity as before. But underneath that quiet lies a profound, institutional memory of the morning when the system failed. The empty holsters are gone, replaced by the tools of defense, ensuring that the legacy of July 22nd is not one of permanent vulnerability, but a society that had the courage to look at its own failures, honor its fallen heroes, and rebuild its sanctuary stronger than it was before. The scales of justice, once violently disturbed, have settled back into a position of steady, guarded equilibrium, a quiet testament to the enduring resilience of a community that refused to let terror define its future. The resolution of the legal and institutional aftermath regarding the Fagatogo High Court tragedy ultimately left the territory of American Samoa with a profound sense of closure that was nevertheless tethered to a permanent, indelible sadness. As the years extended into a decade and beyond, the physical site of the incident underwent subtle, yet significant, transformations, gradually reclaiming its role as a sanctuary of law while simultaneously serving as a memorial to the loss that had occurred within its walls. The lobby, once the stage for the most brutal act of violence in the history of the island, was renovated with careful attention to both its administrative function and its solemn past. Modern security features, once vehemently opposed or ignored, were integrated into the architecture with silent, pervasive efficiency. Metal detectors, secured access points, and the visible presence of armed bailiffs became the new baseline for the courthouse environment. These measures were not implemented with the intent of intimidating the public, but rather as a necessary, mature acknowledgement that the judiciary cannot operate in a vacuum, isolated from the risks of the outside world. The space that had once been stained by the tragic intersection of rage and defenselessness was repurposed, its white walls now reflecting a sense of hardened order rather than the naive peace of the past. The sociological impact on a local community was equally profound, fostering a more sophisticated understanding of the role of law enforcement and the necessity of state power in maintaining a truly free society. The debate that had once polarized the territory, the choice between a traditional, non-lethal policing model and a modern, defensive one, gradually subsided into a broad, unspoken consensus. The citizens came to realize that the act of arming the police was not a betrayal of their cultural values, but a protective measure of their freedom. The ability of the police to provide security was seen as a fundamental precondition for the community to function, to conduct its business, and pursue its daily lives without the underlying anxiety of unchecked threat. This shift in public perception was perhaps the most enduring victory for the reform movement that had emerged in the wake of the tragedy. It represented a collective growth, a community-wide maturation that moved beyond the binary choice of either community tradition or security, toward a synthesis that allowed for both. The tragedy had stripped away the superficiality of their debates, forcing them to address the core necessity of protection with clarity that only such extreme, personal loss could provide. Reflecting on the timeline of the investigation and the subsequent judicial process, it becomes evident that the system, despite its initial failures, eventually succeeded in its primary duty of containment and accountability. The legal path taken, from the immediate panicked response of the scene to the slow, grinding machinery of the appellate and sentencing phases, was a test of the rule of law under the most strenuous circumstances possible. The territory's institutions, forced to operate in the glaring, unyielding spotlight of public tragedy, were required to demonstrate their efficacy, their transparency, and their ability to uphold the principles of justice even when the emotional impetus for vengeance was overwhelming. The fact that the process was characterized by adherence to strict procedural guidelines, rather than succumbing to the immediate, popular demand for extrajudicial or poorly executed retribution, stands as a quiet tribute to the strength of the legal foundations upon which American Samoa is built. The system proved that it could withstand the weight of its own failures, dissect them, and use the wreckage to construct a more durable and reliable framework for the future. The personal resonance of the tragedy continued to cycle through the generations, particularly within the ranks of the police department itself. Every new recruit entering the training academy was introduced to the history of the Fagatogo High Court shooting as a foundational lesson in the realities of their chosen profession. They were not just taught tactical maneuvers or constitutional law. They were told the story of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown. They learned of his character, his dedication to the community, and the circumstances of his sacrifice. This oral history, passed down from veteran officers to the next generation of public servants, ensured that his legacy was not consigned to a dusty file in a basement archive, but remained an active, breathing part of the organizational culture. It fostered a deep, institutional sense of responsibility among the officers, a commitment to never allowing the vulnerability that claimed their predecessor to occur under their watch. This culture of professional vigilance, informed by the tragedy but not defined by it, became a defining characteristic of a new era of law enforcement on the island. It created a standard of service that was simultaneously humble, grounded in the community, and rigorously prepared for the worst-case scenarios, a standard that has since defined the daily operations of the force. Furthermore, the academic and historical scrutiny of the case evolved over time, shifting from immediate, visceral reactions to a broader, more contemplative analysis of the incident's place in the history of American territories. Scholars and public safety experts frequently cited the Fagatogo case in debates regarding the challenges of policing in isolated or remote regions. It became a canonical example of the dangerous consequences of maintaining outdated public safety statutes in a globalized, increasingly volatile world. The case served to underscore the reality that geography does not provide a buffer against the capacity for human violence. It challenged the notion that certain jurisdictions could remain immune to the trends of urban crime simply because of their traditional cultural compositions. The lessons drawn from American Samoa's experience travel far beyond its own shores, contributing to a more informed, nuanced understanding of how remote communities can effectively balance their traditional heritage with the imperative of modern public safety. In this sense, the tragedy, while horrific in its inception and deeply painful in its execution, contributed to a global body of knowledge regarding law, security, and essential responsibilities of governance. The long-term emotional recovery of the families involved remains a quiet, private narrative, one that is largely shielded from the public gaze, as it should be. The weight of losing a loved one in such an explosive, high-profile event is a burden that does not simply dissolve with the passage of time. It changes form, becoming a permanent part of the family's identity, a sorrow that is woven into the fabric of their daily existence. For those who lost their fathers, brothers, and sons on that July morning, the justice that was eventually served could never be enough to address the magnitude of their loss. Their quiet, dignified perseverance in the years following the shooting is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They lived through the pain of the public memorializations, the grueling nature of the trial, and the relentless attention of the media, all while navigating their own private journeys of grief. Their ability to move forward, to find meaning in the aftermath, and to contribute to the community in their own ways is perhaps the most profound resolution that could be attained. They carried the memory of their loved ones with grace, ensuring that their names were not just associated with a single day of violence, but were honored as parts of a legacy of service, duty, and community integrity. As the years pass and the details of the incident become more distant, historical concern for the general public, the fundamental character of American Samoa remains rooted in the values that have always defined its identity. The tragedy did not break the community. Instead, it clarified their priorities and strengthened their collective resolve. The transition they underwent was one of awakening, a shedding of illusions that had once obscured the necessity of professionalized and prepared law enforcement. They emerged from the darkness of those 30 seconds with a more realistic and ultimately more secure appreciation of the peace they work to maintain every single day. The island remains a place of deep connection and cultural richness, but is now also a place of institutional maturity, where the reality of the past is not forgotten, but is actively employed to ensure that the future remains protected. The tragedy, for all its horror, ultimately served to define the boundaries of the community's evolution, marking the moment when they chose to take the responsibility for their own security into their own hands, with a full, practical understanding of what that responsibility entails. Ultimately, the story of the Fagatogo High Court shooting serves as a permanent, cautionary narrative about the fragility of order and the absolute, non-negotiable requirement of being prepared to defend it. The silence that now defines a courtroom, the orderly nature of the security protocols, and the presence of officers who are both protectors and protectors by design, all stand as symbols of hard-won victory over the chaos that once threatened to tear the territory apart. The justice delivered was not about the vindication of a single act of violence, but about the long-term stabilization of society that decided it would no longer gamble with the safety of its protectors. It is a story that has reached its conclusion, a historical arc that moved from ignorance to realization, from tragedy to reform, and from vulnerability to strength. The narrative of the Fagatogo incident is now complete, etched into the collective memory of the territory as a dark, essential truth that informs every aspect of their modern, cautious, and stable peace. It is a peace that is cherished not because it is assumed to be eternal, but because it is now understood to be an active, guarded achievement, requiring the constant vigilance and the unwavering dedication of those who, unlike their fallen predecessors, now stand fully equipped to face the inevitable challenges of the future. The island's commitment to this new standard, forged in the fires of Courthouse Lobby, ensures that while the memory of the loss remains as poignant as ever, the vulnerability that allowed it to happen is relegated to the past, a relic of a time before the community fully understood the true, heavy cost of its own security. The final chapter of this narrative is not one of dramatic revelation or further conflict, but rather a quiet, deliberate reflection on the nature of endurance and the process of cultural healing that followed the catastrophe in American Samoa. In the years that have since unfolded, the memory of the Fagatogo High Court shooting has been subtly transformed, transitioning from a raw, open wound into a permanent, scar-like landmark within the collective consciousness of the islanders. This process of psychological and institutional assimilation is perhaps the most significant outcome of the tragedy, far exceeding the impact of the legislative changes or the imprisonment of the perpetrator. It represents a quiet, daily labor of an entire community as it reconstructs its reality in the aftermath of an event that fundamentally challenged its understanding of home, safety, and the limits of traditional social control. The trauma did not just happen to the individuals present in the lobby, it happened to the idea of the territory itself. And the subsequent years were spent carefully tending to the restoration of that social fabric. The role of traditional culture in the recovery process cannot be overstated. American Samoa possesses a deeply rooted, resilient social architecture based on the principles of family, hierarchy, and a profound, shared sense of duty. In the months and years following the shooting, these cultural pillars provided a structure for grief that was far more comprehensive than any formal government initiative. Families supported families. Elders guided the younger generation through a confusing thicket of public anger and personal sorrow. And the communal practices of memory ensured that those who were lost were not merely statistics of a failed security policy, but recognized as beloved sons, brothers, and protectors of communal peace. This cultural response provided a necessary counterbalance to the clinical, procedural nature of the legal proceedings and the sterile, administrative focus of the legislative reforms. It ensured that the human cost of the violence was never obscured by the technical discussions of tactical failures or constitutional loopholes. As the physical landscape of the courthouse was renovated and the security apparatus hardened, the community continued to navigate the tension between their traditional, welcoming way of life and the demands of a more guarded existence. This tension is perhaps the most honest legacy of the tragedy. It manifests in the way the local police force interacts with the public, a balanced approach that seeks to maintain the community-oriented spirit of the past while operating within a framework of professional, defensive readiness. The officers who walk the beat today are the custodians of the synthesis, understanding that their authority is effective only if it remains grounded in the trust and respect of the people they protect. They have learned that being armed is not a substitute for being known, and that the ultimate security of the territory rests on the strength of the relationships between the police and the families they serve. This realization has turned the tragedy into a foundational lesson for the next generation of public servants, who are trained to view their professional duties through the lens of both tactical vigilance and social empathy. The broader international perspective on the incident, while less personal, also contributed to the territory's maturation. The case of the Fagatogo shooting became a notable point of reference in professional law enforcement circles, particularly regarding the challenges of policing in small, isolated, or tradition-heavy jurisdictions. It served as a stark, undeniable case study for researchers studying the dynamics of active shooter incidents in environments where such violence was previously considered an impossibility. The data derived from the incident, the timing, the reaction, the outcome, and the subsequent reform provided valuable insights into the necessity of proactive, rather than reactive, security planning. This academic and professional interest, while distant from the personal pain of the survivors, provided a sense of validation for the necessity of the changes that were made. It confirmed that the territory's journey from vulnerability to resilience was not a localized aberration, but a necessary evolution in response to the changing nature of public safety threats worldwide. Looking back at the entire trajectory, from the morning of the acquittal to the silence of the prison cell, one is struck by the absolute, irrevocable finality of the violence. It was a moment of profound rupture, of violent tear in reality of the territory that forced an entire society to stop and rethink the most basic assumptions of its governance. The story of Fagatogo is a testament to the fact that peace is never a passive state, but an active, constant negotiation between the will to be free and the necessity to be protected. The community of American Samoa, through its pain, its public debates, its legislative shifts, and its years of patient recovery, has effectively written its own response to this reality. They have shown that while a single violent act can cause immense, irreparable damage, it does not have the power to define the future of society that is willing to face its failures with honesty and a collective commitment to change. The final image of this narrative is not one of a building, a courtroom, or a prison cell, but of the people of American Samoa moving forward. It is an image of society that has emerged from the shadow of its own tragedy, carrying the weight of its history with a quiet, steely determination. The institutions they have built, the laws they have revised, and the culture of vigilance they have fostered all stand as symbols of community that refuses to be defined by its trauma. They have succeeded in integrating the lesson of the past into the ongoing work of the present, ensuring that the legacy of those who fought and died in the lobby is honored not through endless cycles of grievance, but through the maintenance of society that is fundamentally better, safer, and more realistic than it ever was before. The quiet, daily rhythm of life on the island continues, a testament to the resilience of community that has learned to live in the light of its own truth. This, then, is the conclusion of the saga of the Fagatogo High Court shooting. It is a story that has reached its necessary final resolution, with every question answered, every policy rectified, and every consequence of crime fully realized by the machinery of justice. The legal and social arc has completed its cycle, moving from the sudden eruption of chaos to the settled, stable peace of the current era. The events of that July day remain a dark, foundational fact, but one that no longer holds the power to disrupt or define the trajectory of the territory's future. The case is closed. The files are archived in the memory, while sharp and poignant, has been absorbed into the broader, ongoing story of a people who have proven their ability to withstand the worst of human nature and emerge with their dignity and their society intact. The narrative remains as a silent, cautionary witness to the past, a story that is now a part of the history books, providing a permanent, essential context for quiet, guarded, and resilient peace that defines the current reality of American Samoa. In the end, the most enduring lesson of the Fagatogo incident is the reminder that the protection of the innocent is the most sacred and heavy responsibility of any civil society, and that this responsibility can never be delegated to the hope that malice will not appear. It is a responsibility that demands a readiness to act, the wisdom to prepare, and the courage to face the reality of the threats that exist. The territory has paid the highest possible price to learn this truth, and its transformation into a modern, vigilant society stands as an enduring tribute to the lives that were claimed in the process. The narrative has now reached its rest, the echoes of the gunfire having long since been replaced by the steady, measured pulse of community that, through its own suffering and its subsequent resolve, has finally achieved a true, sustainable, and entirely mature peace. The final record has been written. The accounts have been settled by the law, and the society stands firm, a testament to the fact that while tragedy may shatter the peace, it cannot destroy the fundamental resilience of a people who choose to build again, wiser, stronger, and more prepared than they ever were before. This is the finality of the case, A tragedy turned into a cornerstone of a secure future, a dark moment transformed into a lasting lesson, and a community finally at rest, standing securely in the peace it now knows how to defend. The story ends not with a flourish, but with the quiet, persistent strength of society that has looked into the darkness, survived, and walked forward into the light of a new and safer day. The quietude that now defines the environment surrounding the Fagatogo High Court is not merely the absence of sound, but profound, structural silence that speaks to the finality of the events that occurred there. For a visitor observing the courthouse today, the visual landscape offers little hint of the chaos that once erupted within its walls. The white walls have been repainted, the floors polished to a mirror-like finish, and the daily administrative functions of the judiciary proceed with a rhythmic, predictable precision that belies the historical depth of the site. Yet, to those who were present, and to those who have studied the exhaustive records of the incident, the air inside holds a different quality, one thick with the weight of memory and the gravity of the lessons learned. The transition of the building from a scene of unmitigated tragedy to a functioning institution of law represents a successful, albeit arduous, process of societal reconciliation. It signifies the ability of a community to inhabit the sites of its greatest failures without being paralyzed by them, utilizing those very locations as reminders of the necessity for constant, vigilant governance. The societal shift in American Samoa, crystallized by the events of that July morning, extended far beyond the immediate legislative and tactical changes that were implemented in the direct aftermath. It manifested in a deeper, more subtle transformation of the public's relationship with the state. The population, having witnessed the absolute limits of their previous, traditional security model, developed a more critical, informed perspective on governance. They became participants in a more mature political discourse, one that valued the necessity of state power when utilized to protect the fundamental rights and safety of citizenry. This maturation was reflected in the support for subsequent public safety initiatives, as the community demonstrated a willingness to invest in and prioritize the infrastructure of security. They had learned, through the most painful experience imaginable, that the protections afforded by a modern legal and law enforcement framework were not luxuries, but the very scaffolding upon which their way of life was supported. This newfound awareness became a permanent feature of the territory's civic culture, guiding the priorities of its leaders and the expectations of its residents. The professional evolution of the police force in the years following the shooting also warrants careful consideration. The modernization of their tactics, the upgrading of their training, and the adoption of modern, professional standards were not just administrative requirements. They were essential components of the organizational healing process. By embracing a more professional, sophisticated approach to policing, the force reclaimed its confidence, moving past the trauma of its historical defenselessness. This evolution was characterized by an emphasis on intellectual development, critical thinking, and a commitment to serving the community through proactive, preventive measures. The officers of today possess a sense of purpose that is informed by the history they carry, a duty that is performed with professional distance and technical proficiency that ensures they are never again at the mercy of chance. This transformation has successfully shifted the department from a reactive, vulnerable entity into a proactive, resilient organization capable of handling the complexities of modern public safety challenges. The long-term judicial consequences of the case also left an indelible mark on the territory's legal heritage. The exhaustive trial, the complex constitutional maneuvering, and the ultimate resolution of the sentencing phase served as a comprehensive, practical education for the local bar and the judiciary. The lawyers who navigated those proceedings, the judges who presided over them, and the administrative staff who supported them, all emerged from the experience with a sharper, more rigorous understanding of the demands placed upon a legal system when it is tested by extreme violence. The precedents set by the case, the procedural protocols that were refined during its duration, and the administrative lessons that were codified in the aftermath, all serve as foundational elements of the current territorial jurisprudence. The legal system, like the police force, became a more robust, mature entity, better prepared to handle the most severe manifestations of criminal conduct through the disciplined application of the law. The narrative of the Fagatogo High Court shooting, when examined in its totality, offers a universal and perhaps eternal lesson about the nature of order in a civil society. It highlights the inherent, fragile tension between the traditional, community-based ideals of peace and the harsh, unpredictable reality of human malice. The story serves as a reminder that the maintenance of order requires more than just the good intentions of the populace. It requires the active, systemic, and adequately equipped defense of those ideals. The territory of American Samoa, through its collective trauma and its subsequent decisive action, succeeded in demonstrating that a society can endure a profound, violent fracture and still manage to rebuild itself into something more coherent, protective, and realistic than it was before. The tragedy was not the end of their story, but the moment when they took control of the narrative, defining for themselves the terms upon which they would survive and thrive. As we conclude this retrospective examination, it is crucial to recognize that the lives lost in the lobby of the Fagatogo High Court were not sacrifices made in vain. Their existence and the circumstances of their deaths provided the absolute, necessary pressure required to push the territory toward a state of modern protective maturity. Every safety protocol in place today, every armed officer patrolling the streets, and every institutional mechanism designed to anticipate and prevent such violence is a direct, albeit tragic, result of their contribution to the society they were sworn to protect. They remain as the unseen, silent foundation of the current order, their memory honored not through the dwelling on a moment of their passing, but through the enduring, successful maintenance of security they were ultimately deprived of. The territory they left behind is a society that has learned to see the world as it is, rather than as they once hoped it might be, and this, in itself, is a victory of the highest, most meaningful order. The final record of the Fagatogo case is thus a testament to the resilience of the human experience when faced with the absolute, existential threat of violence. The archives, which contain the detailed reports, the legal transcripts, and the historical documentation of the event, serve as a final, comprehensive testament to the event's reality. They ensure that the history of the territory remains anchored in truth, providing future generations with an honest, unvarnished account of the costs of complacency and the necessity of vigilance. The case is now entirely a matter of historical fact, a settled issue that no longer requires the active attention of the judicial or the legislative systems, but which nonetheless continues to inform the daily operations of both. The transition is complete. The chaos of the past has been systematically absorbed into the order of the present, leaving the territory firmly established in a state of stable, guarded, and entirely mature peace. The conclusion of this saga is one of quiet, persistent stability. The Fagatogo High Court continues to stand as the centerpiece of the judicial process in American Samoa, its halls filled with the mundane, necessary activities of a functional society. The people who pass through its doors are no longer fearful. They are assured, protected, and fully aware of the serious, protective measures that govern their presence there. The narrative of the shooting, once a fresh, agonizing, and overwhelming force of nature, has been reduced to a historical milestone, a fact that resides quietly at the back of the community's mind as they go about the business of living. The territory has fully integrated the lessons of the tragedy, moving beyond the phase of mourning and reform into an era of steady, professional existence. The case is, at long last, effectively and entirely closed, its lessons fully absorbed, its wounds sufficiently healed, and its story permanently secured within the annals of the territory's history, leaving the people of American Samoa to move forward, forever changed, but fundamentally and unshakably intact. This, finally, is the true, lasting legacy of the Fagatogo High Court shooting. The emergence of society that, having stared into the face of its own absolute, tragic vulnerability, chose to respond with the necessary, unwavering strength required to defend its own future, thereby securing a lasting, mature peace that will continue to endure long after the memory of the gunfire has become a distant, almost forgotten whisper in the halls of justice. The enduring legacy of the Fagatogo High Court tragedy resides not in the dramatic, historical snapshot of the violence itself, but in the slow, meticulous, and profoundly meaningful reconstruction of the social and institutional identity that followed. As we reach the final contemplation of this narrative, it becomes clear that the territory of American Samoa did not merely survive a period of intense trauma. It underwent a foundational evolution that fundamentally redefined its relationship with the concepts of justice, security, and communal responsibility. The tragedy served as a brutal, clarifying lens, stripping away the layers of optimistic assumption that had long obscured the necessity of professionalized protection. What remained in the aftermath was a community that was forced, through the sheer gravity of its loss, to reconcile its traditional values with the harsh, modern realities of criminal violence. This reconciliation was not achieved through a single revolutionary act, but through years of patient, deliberate, and sometimes painful effort by individuals, families, and institutions working in concert to ensure that the fabric of the society will remain unbroken. The psychological landscape of the territory is now characterized by a maturity that is both guarded and deeply resilient. The people of American Samoa today live in a peace that is understood not as a static, natural condition of their island life, but as a deliberate achievement, maintained through the daily, professional vigilance of those tasked with its defense. This nuanced perspective on public safety is perhaps the most significant intellectual achievement to emerge in the aftermath of the tragedy. It represents a move away from the binary, polarized debates of the past, where security was often framed as an affront to community tradition, toward a holistic, integrated understanding where the presence of an armed, capable police force is recognized as an essential guardian of that very tradition. The ability to hold these two truths in balance, that they are a people defined by their deep communal bonds, and that they are a people who require protection of a modern armed state, is a defining mark of their social maturity in the current era. The physical structures of justice, particularly the High Court building itself, now operate as a testament to this evolution. Every security protocol currently in place, from the structured entry processes to the professional conduct of the bailiffs and officers within, serves as a quiet, constant reminder of the lessons learned at such a heavy cost. The lobby, which once bore the horrific graphic evidence of the shooting, now functions as a space of measured, orderly transit. It is no longer a place where the unexpected can shatter the peace with impunity. The modern architecture of the building, which includes the necessary, invisible layers of security that protect the judicial process, stands as a symbol of society that has successfully internalized the reality of its own vulnerability and responded with the necessary, mature, and systemic preparation. This evolution of space is a powerful metaphor for the evolution of society, illustrating how the territory has taken the chaotic, traumatic history of the site and transformed it into a stable, functional foundation for its present and future operations. The professional culture within the police department has similarly solidified into a model of service that is grounded in a deep, institutional understanding of both the gravity of their duties and the sanctity of the community they protect. The recruitment, training, and ongoing development of the officers who now serve in American Samoa are informed by a commitment to excellence that is as much about the prevention of tragedy as it is about the professional response to it. There is an unmistakable sense of purpose within the ranks, a shared understanding that the badge they wear is not merely a symbol of authority, but a heavy, meaningful responsibility to the memory of those who fell before them. This culture of service is professionalized, technically proficient, and deeply compassionate, creating an environment where the police are both respected for their capability and trusted for their commitment to the traditional values of the island. It is a synthesis that effectively bridges the gap between the past and the present, ensuring that the force remains a relevant, effective, and deeply embedded component of the community's daily life. The legal and judicial processes that were refined in the years following the case have also become the permanent bedrock standards for the territory. The judicial administration has developed a highly rigorous approach to risk assessment, interagency cooperation, and courtroom management, ensuring that the environment where justice is administered remains a bastion of safety and procedural integrity. This professionalization of the judicial environment has bolstered public confidence in the legal system, reinforcing the understanding that the law is not just a theoretical framework, but a living, protective entity that must be actively defended and maintained. The experience of the trial, for all its procedural complexity and emotional weight, serve as a vital, practical education that has resulted in a more confident, prepared, and consistent judiciary. The legal community's dedication to this standard ensures that the mistakes of the past are not just avoided, but are actively guarded against through the disciplined, habitual application of modern administrative and procedural excellence. When we consider the lives of the survivors, the officers who fought with their bare hands, the families who endured the agonizing trial, and the community members who witnessed the horror, we see a testament to the enduring capacity of the human spirit to find meaning in the wake of profound loss. Their individual journeys toward recovery, though largely private, have collectively contributed to the resilience of the entire territory. They have shown that while the memory of the shooting is an inescapable part of their history, it does not need to be the defining force of their lives. By finding ways to move forward, by contributing to the community's ongoing project of development and reform, and by honoring the fallen with dignity rather than bitterness. They have set the standard for how a society can process trauma without being consumed by it. Their resilience is the unseen engine behind the territory's successful transition, providing the moral foundation for the legislative and institutional changes that were made. The historical significance of the Fagatogo tragedy is now firmly established, and it is a significance that emphasizes the necessity of truth, transparency, and a commitment to systemic improvement. By documenting the case with such rigor, by cataloging the failures with such surgical precision, and by implementing the reforms with such comprehensive dedication, the territory of American Samoa has provided a model for how any community can navigate the most severe manifestations of criminal violence. The historical record, preserved in the archives and reflected in the daily operations of the police and the courts, stands as a final, permanent guard against the complacency of the past. It is an honest, unvarnished history that serves as a permanent, essential context of the current peace, ensuring that the lessons learned remain as vivid and relevant as the day they were first discovered in the wreckage of courthouse lobby. In the final assessment, the story of the Fagatogo High Court shooting is one that has achieved a profound, lasting resolution. It is a story where the chaos of a single violent morning was slowly, methodically, and entirely transformed into the stable, secure, and professionally managed reality of the present. The machinery of justice, though tested to its absolute limit, ultimately functioned as it was designed to, delivering accountability and creating the space for a necessary, territory-wide transformation. The people of American Samoa, having navigated the most painful chapter of their collective history, have successfully integrated that history into the ongoing life of their community. They stand now in a position of strength, a society that has emerged from the darkness of its own vulnerability into the steady, guarded light of a future that is carefully and deliberately secured. The saga of Fagatogo has reached its final, conclusive point, and the territory remains profoundly changed but entirely and resiliently whole, looking forward with the clarity of a people who know the true, heavy cost of their own safety, and who remain entirely, unshakably committed to the permanent preservation of the peace they have so laboriously achieved. This, at last, is a complete, final history of the event, a narrative that is now closed, resolved, and firmly placed within the annals of the territory's journey, leaving the people to continue their path, forever mindful of the past, but entirely focused on the secure, protected future they have so rightfully built. The gunfire that morning has long since faded into the silence of history, replaced by the persistent, steady heartbeat of community that has finally and fully come home to itself, safe, prepared, and standing firmly in the light of the justice it has learned to protect. The conclusion of the narrative surrounding the Fagatogo High Court tragedy is not merely the end of legal or historical inquiry, but the beginning of an enduring state of societal equilibrium that defines the modern era of American Samoa. As we cast our perspective forward, looking at the territory as it exists in this present moment, we see a community that has successfully transcended the acute paralysis of its own history. The evolution from a state of vulnerable innocence to a state of guarded, resilient maturity is now a completed process, woven into the very fabric of how the island functions, how its laws are administered, and how its citizens interact with the institutions that serve them. This final state of being is characterized by a quiet, pervasive awareness, a shared understanding among the people that the peace they inhabit is not a passive inheritance, but an active achievement maintained by the vigilance of their institutions and the maturity of their own civic participation. The tragedy, while still remembered with profound solemnity, no longer functions as an act of disruption. It has become an integrated, stabilizing pillar of the territory's historical identity, providing the essential context for the stable, professionalized reality that defines the current age. The architecture of the modern courthouse, now fully integrated with the necessary and professional security protocols, stands as a symbol of this final, stable reality. There is no tension between the role of the building as a place of justice and its role as a secure facility. They are now understood as one and the same. The staff who manage the daily operations, the bailiffs, the security personnel, the administrative teams, and the judiciary operate with a level of professional coordination that is a direct descent of the reforms enacted in the aftermath of the shooting. This administrative harmony is a profound improvement over the disorganized, fragmented approach that characterized the era before the incident, It demonstrates a society that has finally mastered the technical and procedural aspects of its own governance, ensuring that the critical infrastructure of justice is shielded from the unpredictable impulses of criminal violence. This mastery is not a source of arrogance, but a quiet, foundational confidence that allows the judicial process to proceed with the solemnity and focus it requires, undisturbed by the shadow of systemic vulnerability. The community's ongoing relationship with its law enforcement agency further exemplifies this final, integrated state. The police force of the day does not view itself as an occupying entity, nor does the public view it as a distant or threatening authority. Instead, the force is understood as a vital, professionalized extension of the community's collective will to remain safe. The integration of modern defensive capabilities, including the routine carrying of service weapons, has been successfully reconciled with the traditional values of the island, creating a synthesis that feels both natural and entirely necessary. This professional reconciliation has fostered a sense of stability that was simply not possible when the police were left defenseless. The citizens now interact with an armed, capable force that reflects their own commitment to the preservation of their way of life, and the officers, in turn, conduct themselves with a disciplined empathy that respects the deep cultural roots of the people they serve. This reciprocal trust is the greatest, most enduring outcome of the long, painful period of reform, and it serves as the ultimate guarantee of the territory's continued stability. Looking back at the trajectory of the reform movement, we see that it was fundamentally a process of intellectual and institutional decompartmentalization. For decades, the territory had artificially separated the idea of community peace from the requirement of state-sponsored protection, creating a dangerous, theoretical void in the middle of their social order. The tragedy at Fagatogo systematically collapsed this void, forcing society to integrate the necessity of force into their traditional vision of a peaceful community. This integration was not a surrender of their values, but the ultimate expression of them, as it demonstrated that the preservation of their way of life was valuable enough to merit the establishment of a modern, defensive capacity. This move toward a more integrated, realistic view of governance is a defining intellectual legacy of the case, and it continues to guide the policy-making processes that keep the territory aligned with the realities of the modern world. The legal and judicial processes, having reached their final resolution, leave behind a body of precedent and administrative practice that continues to serve as the guiding light for the territory's jurisprudence. The lessons learned during the trial, the appellate stages, and the subsequent implementation of new court rules have been codified into a system that is robust, transparent, and entirely predictable. There is no longer a question of how the legal system will respond to a serious threat. The protocols are established, the interagency communication channels are open, and the commitment to procedural excellence is total. This professional predictability is the hallmark of a mature legal system and provides a level of comfort and security to the citizenry that was absent before the incident. The law, which had once seemed brittle and prone to catastrophic failure, has been tempered by experience and reformed into a structure that is both flexible and enduring, capable of addressing the most difficult challenges without fracturing. In the final contemplative moments of this historical review, it is essential to return our attention to the human scale of the story. The legacy of the victims is not merely found in the statutes they inspired or the buildings they helped to redesign. It is found in the everyday, uninterrupted lives of the citizens who now walk the halls of justice with an inherent sense of security. Every child who attends a school in peace, every entrepreneur who conducts business without the fear of erratic, violent interference, and every family that maintains the traditional ties of island life in an atmosphere of modern safety. All are beneficiaries of societal pivot that occurred in the wake of the tragedy. Their lives are the ultimate validation of the reforms, the living, daily evidence that the sacrifice of those lost was not a conclusion, but a catalyst of preservation and advancement of the community. This recognition provides a final layer of meaning to the tragedy, transforming the memory of the dead into protective, guiding spirit of the living. The final record of the Fagatogo High Court shooting is, therefore, one profound, successful transformation. The island community, having been forced to confront the absolute worst of human nature, did not fracture or retreat. It mobilized its collective intelligence, its cultural resilience, and its institutional capacity to build a future that was fundamentally more capable of protecting itself. The territory of American Samoa stands today as a successful example of how a society, when faced with an existential challenge to its order, can utilize that challenge as the impetus for its own maturation. The story is now complete. The files are finalized, and the memory, while poignant and eternal, no longer possesses a power to cause harm. It has been absorbed into the historical foundation of the territory, serving as a permanent, essential context for the continued success of its people. The gunfire that shattered the lobby of the High Court in 2010 has long since faded into the distance of history, replaced by the persistent, steady, and resilient rhythm of society that has finally and fully come home to itself. As we bring this comprehensive 10-part chronicle to its final close, we are left with the undeniable reality of community that is profoundly whole, entirely secure, and looking forward to the future with the unshakable confidence of those who know exactly how precious and fragile their peace is. The territory remains committed to principles of justice, the necessity of professional defense, and the preservation of its traditional identity, all of which now exist in a state of productive, harmonious coexistence. The long, arduous path from the darkness of the tragedy to the clarity of the present is now fully traversed, and the territory rests in a state of quiet, productive stability that is a true, final inheritance of all those who lived through the experience. The history is written, the lessons are learned, the reforms are settled, and the people of American Samoa stand firm, united by the memory of the past, but entirely focused on the preservation of the secure, protected future they have so rightfully built. This is the ultimate, final truth of the Fagatogo narrative, that the most enduring form of justice is the creation of a society that is strong enough, wise enough, and prepared enough to ensure that the peace it loves is a peace that can truly and eternally endure. The story ends, the record is sealed, and the peace remains, standing as a final, quiet, and triumphant testament to a community that survived the darkness and, in doing so, finally found the light of its own permanent, unshakable reality.